What is going on, Fantasy Fam? Welcome to the Week 15 edition of Plugged In. I am plugged in with the great Scott Barrett. I am JM to win. Scott, my man, how are you doing? I feel like you got like a different side on your screen right now. Is your camera just tilted differently? Or
Yeah,
I'm like seeing a window I don't normally see. Stick with it. I like it. Let's change things up.
Look, yeah. Different angles. You gotta mix things up. This is a fun week. This is a good week. I did not smash, but it was another smash week for some of our subscribers. Neil Ragland, our DFS pro, who won, I don't know, like 400K or like had like four 50K plus weeks 2 years ago. He sent me a text on last Monday and he was like, hey, just like want to let you know, like you've been killing it this year. You've been hitting at an inordinately high rate, like you always do, but just like especially this year, it's coming. I've come really close to piecing everything together. Just haven't had the perfect lineup yet. He ended up winning 100K on FanDuel. So that was awesome to see. That was our second straight week. One of our subs won at least 100K. The week before, we had someone put in like 350 in entries and win like, I don't know, 150K. So that was awesome. Didn't have Evan Ingram, but I had him on one lineup that I swapped off of. Didn't have Jerick McKinnon, but I strongly considered him. We talked on this show that I thought Denver's defense was a little fraudulent. They haven't faced any top 10 quarterbacks all year. I also think matchups don't really matter. And Chris Wecht had this stat that he was spamming out that I put it on my content as well, which is that, McKinnon had like 75% of the red zone usage. Pacheco had only like 8%. So there was some touchdown upside there. It was a gross slate for running backs. So I like the cheap guys. Had way too much James Cook and none of him. But Neil didn't have either of them, and he took down a huge tournament. How was your week? Any thoughts on, I don't know, the week that was?
Yeah, I had a huge weekend. Would have been even bigger. It was a 40K weekend. It would have been an 80K weekend if not for the last Jerry Jeudy touchdown. I also had I finished 10th in the slant out of what is that, like 26,000 entries. Had 0 Evan Ingram and 0 Jerick McKinnon. So you didn't need. I mean, I guess I didn't get first in that. So maybe you did need him to get first. But Miles Sanders is a guy that just nobody ever wants to play him. It's his third 30-pointer of the year. His stats and Dalvin Cook's stats are basically mirror images of each other. Heading into last week, Miles Sanders had 11 fewer carries, 3 fewer rushing yards, 1 more touchdown. I think it was like 11 fewer catches for 70 fewer yards, right? So it was like basically like almost the same points per game and more 30-pointers than Dalvin Cook, and yet everybody feels comfortable playing Dalvin Cook. And no one ever wants to play Miles Sanders. Of course, that's an offense that I've paid a lot of attention to. So understanding like how they deploy players, what they do in different situations. So I felt very comfortable with that one. He was like a must play for me on my main build. Had James Cook on my main build and finished still finished third in the game changer with a James Cook dud, and finished a couple rosters in the top 10 in the 100K power sweep. So yeah, it was a good weekend. I think that one of the things that's important to talk about. So my main build, my whole thought was like, how do I get Jamar Chase and Justin Jefferson and Amon-Ra St. Brown on a roster together without like sacrificing ceiling in other spots? And I think that as we get to this point in the season where everybody is so focused on like, this is an ugly week or all these low scoring teams and all that, right? Like to me, it's just, I said last week that it was like a 10-game slate that felt like a smaller slate than that, because there was so little to choose from. And yet people still like spread out their bets across all these different areas. People still roster CD Lamb at like a 20% clip. People don't think enough about ceiling, right? To me, this last week just lined up so well for my mind, because I was just like, oh, it's like there's very few top options. There's very, very few guys on the slate who could score 30. Now, they're not all going to score 30, but it was like, how do you just identify those guys and get them onto a roster together. And so for me, it was like Miles Sanders can score 30, and then you've got these 3 wide receivers up at the top. Okonkwo obviously opened things up at tight end. I went with a 2 tight end build in a lot of places with Njoku and Okonkwo. Had very little Dulcich, which helped out as well. Although again, the Dulcich disappointment came with the Jerry Jeudy blow up, which I had a lot of Jeudy, but not on my main build. So, but yeah, I think that as we get into these weeks where there's like not a ton to love, people end up on like the Derrick Henrys and the CeeDee Lambs, and of course Derrick Henry, if game script hadn't gotten him, could have had a bigger game. I think you talked last week about why he maybe wasn't as good of a play as people were going to perceive him to be. I've talked a lot about why CeeDee Lamb isn't as good of a play as people perceive him to be, just the way that they call their games. And so, yeah, if we can be like, oh, well, here's some good plays, but also there's only a few guys who can really break the slate. In fact, that's, I think, something that'll be cool to talk about in today's pod. I want to dive into some of these players for this next week and get your thoughts on them, because it's another week where there's like maybe only 3 guys score 30 points. And so it's just about having those guys. And that should be the focus at this point in the season on these sort of thinner slates, is like, how do we just identify and get those guys? So, yeah, that was my approach this last week, and it will be my approach again this next week. Any thoughts on that thought process as far as just being like, hey, look, like, yeah, these guys can score good points, but let's like simplify things for ourselves.
Yeah, so I hated Miles Sanders last week. I mean, like, obviously at ownership, like, he's a great play, but Graham pumped him heavy on the show. Darren pumped him heavy on the show. And I went against that. I said basically he's been a poor man's Jamal Williams this year. And at this point, DeAndre Swift was still on the injury report. He was later taken off of the injury report. And I think he was, banged up, limited usage. But basically, he's like Jamal Williams, but with lesser upside. He's Jamal Williams if Jamal Williams is only allowed to score outside of the red zone instead of getting all of your touches inside the red zones. Heading into last week, he had only 2 games over 18.5 DraftKings fantasy points. And people were talking about, well, the spread is perfect. The matchup is perfect. And it's like, okay, the spread's been perfect all year. It's been amazing matchups all year. But of course he hit, and shout out to Neil, who had him on a Jalen Hurts stack. I was like, nice. No, I want Jalen Hurts this week. He went with the unorthodox stack. I wrote a bunch of words this offseason about why stacking a running back with a quarterback is like more optimal than anyone gives it credit, and is especially optimal because it's never owned. He hit, I tilted that 40-yard rushing touchdown. But no, that was probably a good play. It was just kind of me. I like to be devil's advocate against the other two.
And I want to challenge you too on this, because this is like a thought trap that I fall into sometimes. And I fell into it more often. I fell into it most often in like 2018, 2019, when I just started OWS and I did all the content. And so I had to be so deep in like the numbers and the whatever, right, that I would have a tendency to think a lot more about a player's floor than their ceiling. And so like when you said he'd only had 2 games above 18.5 points, but both of those games were 32 and 34 point games, right? So it's like, to me, in tournaments, when we're on these weeks where things are thin, like it doesn't matter that much that the guy doesn't go over 18 that often, because if he goes for like 22, 23, I'm still not winning, right? But when he goes over, if he can get up to 30 plus, that's what I'm interested in. Any thoughts on like that as being like, you're good about like identifying your blind spots and being like, yeah, that is a blind spot? Or do you think that's not a blind spot in this instance?
Yeah, so I said that on the podcast. I'm like, all right, so 1 out of 6 chance of scoring 30 plus DK, but Jamal Williams is 1 out of 3, and no one ever wants to play him.
Jamal Williams hasn't topped like 24 points, has he?
I'm pretty sure he has, but I'll pull it up right now. Maybe I'm wrong. But what I was going to say, but it's also just the function of like, how many games does he have with, 2 or more touches inside the 10-yard line? And it's like minimal. So it seems like there's no upside. No, yeah, you're right. So 0 30-point games for Jamal Williams, but he does have 4 games with 22.5. So if you want to frame it that way, where it's like, okay, but he doesn't have that massive sort of slate breaking upside, you might be right there. To me, it was just, I don't know that Miles has that, because he's not getting the red zone work. He's losing it to Boston Scott as well as Jalen Hurts. But then again, maybe there's a Chubb component to his archetype where, he can break off those 40-yard runs. He is insanely efficient. He ranks like top 5 all time in yards per carry.
Yeah, that 40-yard touchdown would be tilting in your position if you're like, well, the reason I'm not playing him is because he doesn't get touches close to the end zone, and then he rips off like a low percentage 40-yard run. I totally get you there.
I mean, I had him. It's just like I hate losing, bets to Graham. Like when Graham is right up there. And so
after
he wrote
Graham ditched our show, and then he's right on Miles Sanders and
oh, the jerk. No, so he wrote him up in the Sunday Update. It's an article we write together, and he really swayed Neil, and Neil had him in because of Graham. So like obviously it's a great thing Miles Sanders went off. Neil's process is really interesting. He's just like, all I do is I just read your article every week, and then I write down the names of the players I agree with and who are typically like more unconventional, lesser owned in contrast to the field. And so I think that's a good strategy for all of our readers. I think you and I in particular, especially in comparison to the rest of the space, are really good at finding those players who not a lot of other people are on. I did want to do a little mini recap of some of my lessons learned from the week that was.
I like it.
So Trevor Lawrence went nuclear. And so Jake wasn't on our show this week. He was moving apartments. And he was like, the only thing I need you to say is that I think Trevor Lawrence goes nuclear this week. I don't think the toe injury is a big deal. Everyone wanted to play him last week. No one wants to play him this week. The matchup is even better. I brought that up on the show. I didn't have any exposure, but I liked the call. Instead, I had either Zay Jones or Christian Kirk with way more Zay on something like 80% of my lineups. But it was a great call. Darren backed this call up too. Trevor Lawrence was his highest owned quarterback. But I had 0 Evan Ingram, no comment there. Just went heavy on those wide receivers solo. I wasn't sure what to do there because Christian Kirk, whenever he's not in a bottom 5 matchup, has hit 17.5 DK every single game but one. Just absolutely smashing, except for these bottom tier matchups. And like on paper, this matchup was somewhere around neutral, except it was a top 5 reverse slot funnel, so you knew more volume was coming Zay's way. And I've been a Zay hater all year. But I did like that spot for him. Like I said, I had a ton of Jalen Hurts, but those lineups didn't do anything. My quarterback lineups that cashed were a few Deshaun Watson lineups, which I had barely an exposure to, and a Geno Smith lineup. Tight end, I thought I nailed. I had like 70% Njoku. I had like 20% Okonkwo, 20%, or these numbers aren't adding up, but whatever. Like 15% Dalton Schultz. It's just that Evan Ingram had like 4x his best ever game. But I mean, like if Evan Ingram is going to beat me, I'll live with that. I was a Giants fan. I've seen him drop so many balls. Maybe you have a good read there. I was full fade Derrick Henry, full fade, and all in on Christian McCaffrey. I was saying, like you were saying, all of his best games have come against Houston and Jacksonville. And if you take out those games, his upside is massively overrated. It's like basically beneath James Conner. It's maybe like 12th best percentage odds of hitting 30 DK. And so the counter was like, okay, but he's facing Jacksonville. I'm like, okay, but he's not facing 2021 Jacksonville. Jacksonville ranks top 10 in rushing fantasy points per game allowed, yards per carry allowed. And so first quarter, second quarter, I'm getting trolled on Twitter. They're replying to my article. They're like, great call on Henry, Scott. And I'm just like, I want to kill myself.
Pro tip to everyone, wait till games end because things probably aren't going to play out the way that you expected. What do you finish with, like 23 DraftKings points?
Yeah. And McCaffrey blew him up. So SMD. Sanders, again, great call on them. Probably had like 1 or 2 lineups. Pollard, I liked. But I got absolutely murdered by James Cook and Donta Foreman. I didn't really like Foreman. I'd been saying in my content all week, this is actually a 60-40, 55-45 committee. He just fit everywhere with Panthers defense. He got vultured twice, so he ruined me. I had one of Mixon or Jamar Chase on like 80% of my lineups, maybe 2-1 Chase to Mixon. So he screwed me. I had like 20% Swift. He screwed me. I need to take an L on Justin Jefferson. I wasn't really on him outside of Detroit stacks. Just like a stupid, huge L on my part. But I love Jerry Jeudy. I love Jamar Chase. Juju Smith-Schuster was my Galaxy Brain play of the week, which kind of hit. I love Zay Jones. Love DJ Chark. Biggest L's. Chris Godwin, I said, was like the fantasy points play of the week. He got destroyed. DJ Moore did 0. Amon-Ra St. Brown and Garrett Wilson. I was saying I want Garrett Wilson on 100% of my non-milli lineups. And so this is my big lesson learned, and then I'll throw it back to you for all of your lessons learned, is that every week I make a milli maker lineup with an unorthodox stack where it also fades the top 3 highest owned running backs, wide receivers, and tight ends. And I need to just make way more of that than just my milli lineup. I know we always say this, and I always say I need to do this, and like this is the strategy. Because like I just keep smashing in the milli, like not smashing, but like 2xing, 3xing in the milli. And there's so many weeks, right, where the chalk just bombs, and like Neil's strategy is the unorthodox QB stack. And so like the only thing that would have gotten me off of Amon-Ra and Garrett Wilson was ownership. But like that's just an amazing argument every single week. Also with St. Brown, his splits are a little worse with DJ Chark back, and that offense isn't as concentrated as we like to think it is. But anyway, that's my thought. Just continually learning the same lesson I need to learn.
Sometimes it takes that. Sometimes it honestly does take that. I really like the fact that you had some Deshaun Watson, even though you said you didn't have a lot. I had like 20% Deshaun Watson just because it was like, and not a good matchup, right? Not as bad of a matchup as everybody thought, but it's like, if you're going to give me like a top 6 fantasy quarterback at 2% owned just because because he looked bad in his first game back, you know what I mean? Like maybe he's going to come back and look great. He didn't look great. He looked fine. He's going to keep looking better. Derrick Henry, he had that 50-yard run in the first half, right? And like that immediately skews everything because he's going to get to the 100-yard bonus more quickly. And yet he still, obviously game flow played a part in that. He still slowed down. Trevor Lawrence, interestingly, my very first practice build of the week had Trevor Lawrence. And it was just this thought of like, we know, I mean, on our props package, we're 4 weeks in a row winning a passing prop against the Tennessee defense, right? It was Aaron Rodgers over pass attempts, Joe Burrow over pass attempts, Jalen Hurts over passing yards, Trevor Lawrence over pass attempts. Like we know teams are going to pass against Tennessee. And then when I went in deeper, it was like, you know what, though? The only teams all season that have topped 22 points against Tennessee have been the Bills and Eagles, which are 2 of the best offenses in football, right? And so it was like, okay, well, we're probably not getting a blow-up game from the Jags, but we're going to get a lot of volume, and it's a pretty concentrated offense. And so I was with you. It was like they're not really throwing to Marvin Jones anymore. So it was like Kirk and Zay. I had a lot of Kirk and Zay across my rosters. And I kept looking at Evan Ingram and being like, do I want to loop him into this? And then it was like, well, like what's his ceiling really? You know what I mean? And I don't think that we were wrong on that approach, right? Like I'm going to have plays, like even when I'm playing MME, I still keep a pretty tight list. And so I'm going to have plays who like guys who have like a fluky big game that I just wasn't on. Like you said, you've watched Evan Ingram for a long time. You know who he is. Like we know he's capable of like 22, 25 points, right? But like to put like a true bury you game is going to be a really rare outcome for him. And he did it, right? Like, I don't think it was a bad play for anybody who played him.
Or 1 out of however many games he's
played. Yeah, however many games he's played in his career. Yeah, and it's like, I think anybody who played him, it was a sharp play because it's the same thinking that we had on Kirk and Zay, which is like, largely, it's like the volume's there. And one of the things that, I don't know if you watched my show with Squirrel this last week, but he was like, we were talking about that spot, and Squirrel was like, you know, we like real life teams don't get rewarded for completions, but we do, you know? So like if they're going to throw it 40 times and we know where the ball's going, like we can take advantage of that. So yeah, I think anybody who
on that point
in there. Yeah.
On that point, the Chargers offense is a Ponzi scheme to get Austin Eckler his round 1 draft capital and PPRs. It's like just all we do is throw it horizontally. makes no sense. But Austin Eckler, he's on Yahoo Fantasy. He needs his PPRs.
Chargers offense is like 22nd in DVOA last time I checked, and yet perception of them is like this absolute smash offense that you got to play every week. Their coaching staff needs to be overhauled, to be honest. But Shane Steichen, who they got rid of, and now he's the offensive coordinator for the Eagles. That's part of the problem with the Chargers is they get rid of good coaches and then bring in bad coaches. Anyhow. But yeah, I think that the thought process on Evan Ingram was super sharp. Anybody who played him, but I also think anybody who didn't play him, like you didn't make a mistake by not playing him, in my opinion. There was something else that you brought up. Oh, you brought up that when you were talking about the tight ends. I want to bring this up, and I think it's important. We've spent so long, like sharp DFS players have spent so long talking down two tight end builds. And part of the thinking is a lot of the time when people pay down at tight end, they're paying down and they're like, okay, well, I can save salary here and then pay up in other spots. And they're paying down and getting like the 2,700 guy who hopefully scores like 8 to 10 points. But if there are cheap tight ends who can legitimately score 20, and most of the other cheap wide receivers aren't going to score more than like 15 to 20, right? Like I was looking at Philip Dorsett and Chris Moore, and it was like, what is their ceiling? Chris Moore ended up putting up a huge game, right? 25 points, but it's like, what is their ceiling compared to David Njoku, compared to Greg Dulcich, compared to Okonkwo? And it was like, really, all of these guys have the same ceiling, and yet people don't like pulling the trigger on these two tight end builds, right? And so people are playing like Kendall Hinton, and they're playing like the wide receivers are going to come in higher owned than these two tight end builds. I had so much Njoku plus Okonkwo this last week. And then I mixed in some Dulcich, and I mixed in like some other guys. But if you find these cheap tight ends who can actually go for 20, it's a totally different story. They're basically wide receivers, like that's how these guys are being used. And so take the tight end tag away and be willing to pull the trigger on that two tight end set. I think that was a really sharp way to go this last week. It's going to be a sharp way to go again this next week. And then, you mentioned the Amon-Ra St. Brown, his splits being different with Shark. I actually thought that it was the opposite, right? He put up 37.6 against Jacksonville with Shark in. He put up 42.4 against Washington with Shark in. And my thought had been like the extra spacing that Shark creates on the field. I mean, Shark played limited snaps against Buffalo, but all of Amon-Ra St. Brown's 30-plus point games this year have come with Shark on the field. 42 points, 30.9, right. 37.6.
Right. That was a bad stat for me.
And that was something I was on this last week. Interestingly, my favorite build was Amon-Ra St. Brown, Shark, and Goff. And I had Dante Foreman on there. And I built it on Thursday night, and all day Friday and Saturday, I had 500 in salary left over. All day Friday and Saturday, I was trying to figure out how to use that 500 in salary. I finally had to sacrifice Shark and go to Njoku. And I was like, well, hopefully, like if Shark puts up a 20-pointer, Njoku does as well. And that allowed me to move from Foreman up to Miles Sanders, basically saying like the ceiling on Miles Sanders is higher, or at least his chance of hitting his ceiling are higher than Foreman in like a game against Seattle where they could fall behind or whatever else could happen. That ended up making a big difference in my ROI because I got those extra like 20 points basically from making that shift. And then, last thing I want to hit on from this last week is any thoughts on James Cook. My read there is just like the game flow didn't work in their favor. They didn't have the ball a ton. They weren't able to move the ball. Not surprising against the Jets defense. I still think that James Cook is a sharp way to go moving forward with regards to like, he's not the lead back, right? But he's going to get as many touches as Devin Singletary as a cheaper guy on weeks like last week where there's just not a ton to love at running back. I still think that he's an intriguing guy. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so my argument for him was basically just like I hated the running back slate, and like all the running backs I sort of liked were like uber chalky because it was a small slate and everyone hated the running backs. He did lead the backfield in carries and targets, so I was like, okay, maybe there's more volume. And then we discussed it on this show where Josh Allen has fallen off of a cliff since like week 7. Then over the prior 3 weeks, the running backs have seen like a 52% jump in touches per game. And so, okay, maybe they lean more on the running backs. I nailed, fading Buffalo minus the running backs, but maybe just should have faded everyone because, the running back touches weren't there. And Singletary saw twice as much work as James Cook. Of the cheaper running backs, I also looked at Tony Jones. I didn't have any exposure, but I looked at him. I looked at another cheaper guy. The correct answer was J.D. McKissick, but like I saw the argument.
Not McKissick, McKinnon.
McKinnon, I'm sorry, but like I'm that's one of those plays that feels so thin where it's like I'm never really going to get on it. There were like some arguments that post hindsight especially look really good, but I sort of fell in love with at the time. For Okonkwo, he saw a season high in route share that jumped up to 57%, and he led all players in yards per route run since week 9, heading into that game. And we've just seen in this offense, like I still don't think Treylon Burks is very good. Like, I'm sorry, but he was putting up numbers. He was getting, really good play calls that saw him just totally open. And I don't think that's route running. He was getting design screens. And Brett Whitefield's comp for Treylon Burks was Jonnu Smith. And so it's like, okay, maybe the tight end can do some things. Jerry Jeudy, I really liked a lot. Like his numbers look so shitty, but he's had 50 plus receiving yards in 7 games this season, or 8 games this season. He's only played 7 fully healthy games with a snap share of 60% or more. Kansas City ranks second worst against slot wide receivers. DJ Chark, like league leader in ADOT. Titans just hemorrhaging points to outside wide receivers and like all players on deep balls. So just different things like that. And then Christian McCaffrey, again, just like his usage without Elijah Mitchell and on the 49ers is like, we said it last week, is like that player in that role with that talent should have a projection 20% higher than anyone else. David Njoku, another like obvious, just he's been a juggernaut whenever he's been healthy. And, low ownership, and sure, there's risk that he's not fully healthy, but that was something I wanted to bet on.
Yeah, I'll always take, like, it's burned me, but it's also helped me a ton. Like, I'll always take health risk, right? Like 2 weeks ago was, or 3 weeks, whatever it was, Josh Jacobs, right? It's like, that's health risk. Oh my God. And yet he puts up 51 points. Like when these guys can put up big points and people aren't on them because of health concerns, I'll always take that. Like I said, I've been burned plenty of times by that as well, but I'll take
DeAndre Swift
EV over time.
I had DeAndre Swift last week. And
yeah. And who knows what's going on with him, but yeah. Okay, so I want to fast forward or roll forward to this next week, and I want to pick your brains on basically like all the higher priced players. So I mentioned that this last week, like everyone was so focused on like, oh, it's an ugly slate and there's not a lot to love. And in my mind, I'm like, cool, there's not a lot to love. So let me just like clearly identify what there is to love and figure out how to play those guys together. This next week is another week like that. And what's really interesting is I don't think there's going to be a lot of 30-pointers scored this next week. And the 30-pointers that we could get could actually be some mid-priced players. Like Garrett Wilson is playing the Lions. He's $6K. He's going to be highly owned, but he could be one of those guys that you had to have in order to compete, right? So like I didn't play a ton of him this last week against the Bills, but like this week I could be 100% Garrett Wilson and just bet on like, hey, maybe this is the piece you had to have and I'll just ride up the field with this. If he's 40% owned, like to get double that, you got to get up to like 80% anyway. Garrett Wilson, Miles Sanders, another guy in the 6,500 range. I'm sure there's some other guys that could put up big games sort of down here, but I want to walk through some of these high-priced players. Oh, Mike Williams at 6,300, another one who could put up 30 points. But I want to walk through some of these high-priced players and get your thoughts on which of them like are likeliest to score 30 points. Obviously, it's Tuesday, but just sort of your initial thoughts on these players and these matchups. You mind if I just go player by player and throw some guys your way? All right, so we got Devontae Adams taking on the Patriots. Also, Josh Jacobs taking on the Patriots. So we've had this every week. One of them scores 30 points. One of their tougher matchups, the Patriots, I think it's like 7 of the last 8 years, they've been top 3 in fewest running back rushing touchdowns allowed. Like their whole defense is designed to force you to throw the ball when you get close to the end zone, because analytically it's much easier to score touchdowns on the ground. They're not going to give up a ton of breakaway runs, but it's also easy to be like, oh, well, Davante Adams is in a tough matchup too. And yet Davante Adams is hit against the Broncos twice. Justin Jefferson hit in this matchup. So I feel like if either guy's going to hit, it's likelier to be Davante Adams. Is this likelier to be a week where neither of them hits, or you got any thoughts on Davante Adams in this one?
I think that's the way to frame it. Like the narrative of New England stopping opposing wide receiver ones is going to be in full effect. But is that true? Jefferson went off, Diggs went off, Tyreek had a solid game against them. So I don't know. My lean would probably be Jacobs, but I think you just nailed it when you're like the cheat code this season is have one of them.
One of these guys, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And maybe more exposure to whoever's lower owned of the group. But yeah, on paper, the matchup is probably really difficult for both.
Yeah, I mean, I could see that being a spot where we finally break the streak of 30 pointers from them, but we know that the usage is going to be there, right? Which is like a big part of things. And man coverage defense on the Patriots, like I think one of the things stood out to me. I saw this Mike Reese put out this stat a couple weeks ago. I don't remember exactly what it was, but it was like the Patriots were like 149-12 when they'd won the turnover battle over like the last however many years, right? Or maybe it was 200 something and like 14. It was like a crazy stat, right? And I kind of feel like this Patriots defense, they're less interested in like stopping an opponent on a per play basis, and they're more interested in disrupting, right? So like they're fine. That's like all this aggressiveness, and the like Patriots used to be this sit back, force the opponent to march the whole field. And now this Steve Belichick defense is just aggressive, or I should say Steve Belichick, Gerard Mayo. And the aggressiveness is like they give up more big plays, but they also get more sacks and they force more turnovers, which disrupts drives. So like if a team picks up a 60 yards, but then they turn the ball over or get sacked and taken in a field goal range, that works just as well, right? And I kind of feel like people don't necessarily recognize that, like exactly how the Patriots play, and that could lead to a spot where you still get some like chunk plays from one of these guys. Austin Eckler. So Austin Eckler's playing Tennessee. We know toughest run defense matchup, but also he gets most of his value not through running the ball, but through catching the ball. But what I think is interesting is that Austin Eckler's 30 pointers this year, right? Everything else has been 25 or fewer. His 30 pointers this year against a horrible run defense in Cleveland, against a horrible run defense in Seattle, and against a horrible run defense in Houston. And it's almost like, like he doesn't derive his value from running the ball, but he's still catching the ball close to the line of scrimmage, right? So like teams that miss tackles or give up chunk plays when guys have the ball in their hands are maybe a little bit more valuable to him than a defense like Tennessee. So I'm kind of back and forth on this one, but considering that he's not even hit 3x his salary in any of his other games. All of his other games have been below 3x his 8,500 salary, except for when he played Cleveland, Seattle, and Houston. So any early thoughts on Austin Eckler against Tennessee? Like, obviously we know he'll have a solid game, solid usage, but like, can he score 30 plus, or is this like less likely than people will perceive it to be?
I think in a best case scenario, you're looking at like a Deebo Samuel stat line where he has 35 rushing yards, rushing touchdown, 9 catches, 78 yards, and a receiving touchdown. In a best case scenario, the Titans are the best defense in the league against running backs on the ground, but they're worst against running backs through the air. And you could say, okay, well, Eckler scored 70% of his fantasy points through the air, or whatever it is. And so like, if you view him as a receiver, it's a good matchup. I don't really know the right answer, but yeah, I'm inclined to say I don't really see a ceiling game coming this week.
Yeah, I like the way you laid out those numbers, because then I always say, like, when we can boil things down to numbers, it simplifies things for us, right? It answers our questions for us. That's like a very realistic stat line that you just laid out, and that's 32 DraftKings points. Chances of him getting the 100-yard bonus through the air or on the ground are very low. But if he gets 9 catches, right, he picks up a lot of just like raw points from that. I kind of like to look for guys who, if they score 2 touchdowns, that means they're going well above their like 4X, right? as opposed to guys who need 2 touchdowns just to get to 4x, because then if he scores 2 touchdowns, he gets 4x, and you don't have him, like that doesn't bury you. It might bury you on a week like this where there's not a lot of 30 pointers and you might need those 30 pointers. But like if he scores 0 touchdowns or 1 touchdown, he's right back in that like 18 to 24, 25 point range that he's pretty consistently been in. So I think like, even though it's not a direct answer, I think those numbers really help us see it. Jamar Chase go ahead.
I think Justin Herbert stacks are going to be like massively owned this. Like, everyone's just woken up to the fact that you just play quarterbacks and wide receivers against Tennessee. I'd also want to look at Herbert splits when both Keenan Allen and Mike Williams are healthy. I'm sure they're significantly better. But the thing with Keenan is you can always stack him with Eckler. And like I said, I don't think it's a ceiling game, but maybe that works on the right stack where, his PPR floor is so massive. He's not going to hurt you even if he doesn't have 2 touchdowns. So you could always stack Herbert up with Eckler as well, but that's probably a little too expensive.
Yeah, and I think that people are going to see, like after what Trevor Lawrence did, they're going to flock to this spot, which makes it to me an interesting fade, again, early in the week, but interesting fade just insofar as Tennessee has been solid on defense this year. Justin Herbert has not been what people perceive him to be this year. Like you said, he hasn't had his fully healthy cast, but
then let's follow it that line of thinking to its natural conclusion, which is if Herbert stacks flop and we don't see a ceiling game for Eckler, what happens? And it's okay, Derrick Henry up against the league's worst defense by yards per carry allowed. And wasn't it you who said who only hits in like perfect matchups? Is this not a perfect matchup?
Yeah. I mean, you're right. The only concern with Derrick Henry in this spot is game script. And so if it follows that if you say,
so I don't know that game script matters when the guy gets his 30 touches regardless, right?
Right. No, but I mean, if they fall behind by like 17 points in the second half, right, then he ends up with his 18 to 20 carry game as opposed to his 30 carry game. And then that makes the difference. But no, I think that's like incredibly sharp DFS thinking is like, if we're not betting on the Chargers, we are like, it is one of the easiest running back matchups, right? So like if we're not betting now, granted, we're also like all these guys are high priced players, right? So it's possible that the Chargers win and put up points and Derrick Henry like kind of gets game scripted out and nobody on the Chargers post had to have it score just because, they win like 27 to 14, right? But like if we're saying, the Chargers don't hit, it follows that the likeliest thing then is this is a close game, which means then Derrick Henry is getting more touches. I think that's a super sharp way to look at that. And that definitely like opens up my eyes a little bit in terms of like one of the ways to handle these higher priced guys this week. Another high priced wide receiver, Jamar Chase against Tampa. Any thoughts on, obviously no Tyler Boyd this week. We would expect that T Higgins will be back. Apparently fantasy peeps are real mad at Zach Taylor. Apparently it's Zach Taylor's job to help out the fantasy community as opposed to help the Bengals get back to the Super Bowl. But Jamar Chase against Tampa. Would you prefer him with T Higgins, without T Higgins healthy? I kind of think like T Higgins helps the spacing, right? But then also it's not like Tampa's going to tilt that much toward Jamar Chase and he's going to get the huge target volume. Jamar Chase is definitely one of these guys that I like up here, but it comes with obviously some floor risk against the Tampa defense.
So one of the reasons why I liked Jamar Chase so much this past week was I thought he was healthier than T Higgins. Like he looked great. And T Higgins, picked up that injury, barely practiced. Vibes were bad from the beat writers. And so what has Jamar Chase done in games where T Higgins played but was limited, which is, I think, what we're looking at this week. Week 1, 16 targets, 10 catches, 129 yards and a score. Week 5, 12 targets, not very productive, but 12 targets nonetheless. Week 14 last week, 15 targets, 10 catches, 119 yards and a score. I think there was another limited week from T Higgins in there that I'm missing. So he Chase to me is like a really interesting archetype of a player where if you look back at the last 15 games Chase and Higgins have played together, Chase has outscored Higgins in 8 games out of a potential 15. So it's like not that much. It's like, oh, maybe he's not clearly the wide receiver one. But if you look at the games where he has outscored Higgins, it's by
huge
a
gaps,
massive number. Yeah.
And then Higgins outscores him by like 2, except for that one like 46 pointer last year.
And if you look at like all players in their top 50% of games or top 33% of games or top 25% of games, like no one has Jamar Chase upside. And like that sort of power law upside, I'm always going to gravitate towards in fantasy. As far as the matchup and everything like that, I'll need to dig deeper, but it's just like, this is a player I love and an archetype of a player I love.
AJ
also,
Brown
Burrow's amazing, by the way.
Burrow's amazing. Burrow's awesome.
He's amazing.
Burrow, Josh Allen, Patrick Mahomes is going to be really fun AFC playoffs this year. AJ Brown against Chicago. We would probably assume that this is a game where so AJ Brown is hit in like pass funnel matchups where typically where the game either stays competitive deeper into it or where it's such a pass funnel matchup that the Eagles keep throwing even when they have a big lead. I think there's a misperception around the Eagles offense. Like they come out really pass heavy a lot of the time. Against Houston, they threw it, I think it was 13 times on their first drive of the game against that Houston run defense. Like people think that this is a run heavy offense. What really is the case is they're typically pass heavy in the early going, and then they're winning by so much that they just turn to the run. Or they're playing a team like Green Bay where it's like really good against the pass, bad against the run, and so they just run the ball. But this seems like a spot against Chicago where they would tilt toward the run, and also a spot where they probably take and hold a lead. So AJ Brown's not a guy that I will be high on this week. I think it's been pretty clear the types of spots where we want to target him. But do you have any thoughts on AJ Brown there?
Yeah, I've got a really interesting stat for you. Devonta Smith has seen 8 or more targets in 5 straight games. AJ Brown, 8 or more targets in just 1 out of his last 6 games. That's kind of wild to me. It's like, who is the wide receiver one? I mean, clearly it's AJ Brown by fantasy production, but I think the volume really isn't there. This offense is amazing, but it's not the most pass heavy offense in the world. It's basically like Bears on steroids. And to your point, like if you dig into AJ Brown's numbers, we see a Derrick Henry sort of thing going on, but with way more volatility. His best games. Steelers, 43 fantasy points. That's a top 3 matchup. Titans, 35 fantasy points. That's a top 3 matchup. Lions, early in the season, 29 fantasy points. That's a top 3 matchup. Every other game below 20 fantasy points. And so to me, just this matchup definitely doesn't strike me as a top 3.
Yeah, and I think we've been like, I was on AJ Brown week 1 against the Lions. I was on AJ Brown against Tennessee, and I didn't play AJ Brown against Pittsburgh, but I took his over on alternate receiving yards, like over 100 receiving yards, over 125 receiving yards at like plus 650. So basically was on AJ Brown that week. And those were the only 3 weeks I've been on AJ Brown. Like I think we can kind of see his games coming, which doesn't mean that will like remain 100%, but I think he's like way lower likelihood to score a 30-pointer this week.
I'm on Ross St. Brown. Guys like that.
My gosh, yeah. Especially when the field just sees like unpredictability, and then you're like, okay, cool. Like I understand this guy better than the field does. Let me lean into that a bit. Amon-Ra St. Brown against the Jets is a really interesting one. If we're talking about like, does he score 30 points? And then when we talk about he's scored 30 points 3 times this year, right? Like everybody loves him, but a 22-pointer doesn't help you win a tournament at 7,800 in salary. Amon-Ra St. Brown against the really tough Jets defense on the road this week.
Okay, maybe it's a tough matchup, but we saw Buffalo, at least in their first game, I'll have to check and see if they did it last week, intentionally move Stephon Diggs to the slot on over 50% of his routes run. Ben Johnson's always talking about how much more difficult it is to scheme and stop a slot wide receiver. And this would be the liability to the Jets cornerback core, at least like a lot softer than their two perimeter cornerbacks. So I think you can get around the matchup. To me, what I was saying before, I was wrong on that DJ Chark stat. It's something I had to look up, but I do think we're over. Like the Lions are the Coors Field of DFS this year. If you look at combined points per game, they're smashing everyone else. But their defense has been a lot better, and they're a lot less concentrated than I think they get credit for. Like the Raiders, it's okay. It's either Devontae Adams and Josh Jacobs or just one of those guys. Whereas with this, you got, Jameson Williams is going to see an increased role. You have DJ Chark, who's had back-to-back great games. You have Amon-Ra St. Brown, Josh Reynolds. I think it was Josh Reynolds did a little something last week.
Yeah, like 6 targets, scored a touchdown.
Yeah, and then you have Jamal Williams, who keeps scoring touchdowns. DeAndre Swift can work in and get double-digit targets if he's healthy. And so I think there's some uncertainty there. But yeah, there is the narrative that, like, I've been parroting all season is like, if you just look at the numbers and you look at his last 15 healthy games, Amon-Ra St. Brown is basically Cooper Kupp. What is his price tag? Is it still not?
It's 7,800. Justin Jefferson put up 18.6 against the Jets. Stephon Diggs put up 14.3 and 6.7 against the Jets. I mean, it is like a really, really difficult matchup, and it's like structurally the Jets are just going to make it tough to pick up chunk gains. So you got to pick up like much production, and it's got to be like you got to move the field like consistently and keep these drives going. And the Jets
then he'll rack up PPRs.
Well, you're right, but what I'm saying is he has to do that, right? Like the chunk gains are not going to be there, and the Jets are going to kind of force you to work to like different guys, so it's harder to pick up like the heavy volume. But I do agree, like there are enough weapons, like these other teams that we just talked about. Like Gabe Davis is a weapon, but he's not a guy that like scares a defense. I guess DJ Chark doesn't scare a defense either, but like the offenses that have a ton of weapons are just so much harder to stop, right? Because we've seen Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle, like we've seen down games from the Dolphins because like they're so good, but it's just two guys. Whereas the 49ers, you've got Brock Purdy under center, and they're still unstoppable right now, right? Because they've got Debo and they've got Ayuk and they've got Kittle and they've got Christian McCaffrey. And it's like no matter who you're trying to take away, you can't take them away. So I do see the Lions as like with Swift, with Jameson Williams coming rounding into form, with DJ Chark out there, with Amon-Ra St. Brown. Like they do have a ton of weapons. They are a team that it's harder to isolate a guy. But yeah, I mean, I just think that it's going to be harder for him to score like a 30-pointer in this spot than in some of these other spots that we've had for sure. And then below that, we get to DeAndre Hopkins against the Broncos with Colt McCoy under center. We get to CeeDee Lamb, who has, what is it now? Still one game all season over 22.7 DraftKings points because the Cowboys love to not throw the football. And he still always draws high ownership. We've got Joe Mixon against the Bucs run defense. We've got Tony Pollard at 7,100 against the Jags, and still probably going to see, obviously phenomenal players, explosive upside, but still going to see like 14 to 16 to 17 touches. And so, yeah, like that's kind of like when we're like, hey, who can score 30 points this week? We did paint a picture of Austin Eckler scoring 30 with 2 touchdowns. We painted a picture of maybe one of the Raiders still doing it. Jamar Chase is still interesting. Probably no on A.J. Brown. Probably for me, no on Amon-Ra St. Brown for 30-pointer. Probably no on DeAndre Hopkins, CeeDee Lamb. And then you've got Derrick Henry, as like you said, if you're not betting on the Chargers, then you're essentially saying, well, Derrick Henry probably does hit in this spot, which I think is a really interesting way to go. But yeah, it's a week like this, right, where 30-pointers are going to be tougher to find. And like I said, I mean, you got Mike Williams, you've got Garrett Wilson, you've got Miles Sanders, Chris Olave, right? His best game was 26 points, and I believe that was with Jameis Winston. He really hasn't done much with Andy Dalton, but technically in a game against Atlanta, he has 30-point upside. Jerry Jeudy at 6,100 against Arizona, technically he has 30-point upside. So I think it kind of this mid-range, it might be a week where there's a little bit more value in going to this mid-range because, again, these guys at the top, there's just not as many 30-pointers as people are going to expect. One last guy I want to ask you about who's up here and could score 30 points is Travis Kelce. 7,800 against Houston. And I think the perception is the Chiefs smash. They don't need to pass the ball. And we've seen a lot of times with low ownership on Chiefs players in spots like this, and then they've scored 35 points by halftime. And like Mahomes has 280 yards at the half, and Kelsey's got 25 DraftKings points at the half. I could see a game like that here because the Chiefs aren't just going to come out and go run heavy from jump, right? They're going to play their normal offense and then go run heavy if they have a huge lead. So any thoughts on Travis Kelce here as a guy who I think people will kind of stay off of him because he had 2 down games. They're playing a run funnel team. But on a week where there might not be a lot of 30-pointers, he could be one of those guys who gets there.
Yeah, Travis Kelce, I just keep writing up every week as a top GPP play just because he's basically a top 3 wide receiver by fantasy points per game, but he's priced as like the wide receiver 6 or whatever. So there's upside there, and then upside at a gross tight end position where it could be the case like the first few weeks of the season where either you paid up for, if you didn't pay up for a top tight end, it was impossible to crack the top 150 of the Millie Maker. But yeah, he has had a few down games in a row. So I need to reevaluate that, see what's going on there. And, they're going to get Kadarius Toney back. Juju Smith-Schuster has seen double-digit targets in like almost all of his last 6 healthy games. But I think this is a good segue into potential stacks. And so, yeah, we see Kansas City up against the league's worst run defense. We see the 14-point spread. But if you look historically over the last 3 seasons, games in which Kansas City was favored by 10 or more points, the running backs collectively averaged like 30 rushing yards per game. And Patrick Mahomes averages like 440 passing yards and 4 passing touchdowns per game. And so I'm definitely going to have a ton of Mahomes this week, and I hope he goes lower owns. And I hope a lot of people play Pacheco, who I think is probably a strong value. But like I've been saying, is like he's not being used near the red zone. That is J.D. McKissick, whoever.
Jared McKinnon.
Oh, yeah, I always get those guys mixed up. And so that's how I'm viewing it. What are your thoughts?
No, I love that. And this week, I'm sure I'm deeper into this week than you are, but I think it's Wednesday is when you really turn the page, but we've got Chiefs are implied for 31.5. Eagles are implied for 29.5. Cowboys are implied for 26.5, but we know that mostly comes to a split backfield, so it doesn't help us a ton in fantasy. Right. And every other team on the slate is implied for 23.5 or fewer points. And yet, I think that people will kind of I really like the Jets stacks against the Lions, like because you can get Mike White and Corey Davis and Garrett Wilson cheap, or you can get Mike White and Zonovan Knight and Garrett Wilson cheap. But like, if you're not going that direction, to me, all I've seen so far in my practice builds, again, it's Tuesday, but I've seen like Mike White stacks, I've seen Jalen Hurts naked, and I've seen Patrick Mahomes stacks. Like those are what stand out to me. And I do think that people are going to be like Mahomes is going to be owned, especially because we have so many times. I think it was against the Jets a year or 2 years ago where Mahomes literally had like over 300 yards at halftime. And he was like 2 or 3% owned because people have been like, oh, it's a huge spread. Like the Chiefs are not going to, like Mahomes isn't going to put up a huge game because they're going to win by so much. And then Mahomes is like, yeah, but if we're winning by so much, that's because I'm putting up all these yards and touchdowns, So I think that's a really sharp way to go this week. And again, it's just the sort of thing where people aren't going to define the slate the way that they should. They're not going to look at it and say, okay, there's a limited number of 30-point scores available, so let me just focus on that. And that's kind of how I'll be looking at this slate. And among those limited 30-point scores, like it's Mahomes and one of his pass catchers is very much up there and guys who can do that. So yeah, to me, it's a slate that I like a lot just in terms of like we can condense it pretty easily and then just load up on as much upside as we can. Scott, do you have anything else on your end before we get out of here?
Yeah, I was going to just 2 more potential games. What are your thoughts on Miami Buffalo? Because
is that on the Saturday slate?
Oh, is it off? Okay. So that's off the slate. And Justin Fields. I mean, it's a bad matchup, but I mean,
yeah,
healthier after the bye.
I have a hard time seeing him going for over 30 against the Eagles, but then that type of thinking can get you in trouble. You know what I mean? Like because he's like a matchup agnostic type player when it comes down to it. So yeah, I think the Fields is probably the kind of guy who I'll end up with him on large field builds at a higher rate than the field has him, just because it's like, yeah, but he can hit. But I probably won't have him on tighter builds. I probably won't have him in high dollar single entry or 3-max stuff, because I'll also be like, what are his chances of going for 30 plus points at 7,400, right? I think that's price tag. And Hurts is 8K, Mahomes is 8,100. So he has to outscore both those guys, right, in order to have value on this slate. And I think his chances of doing that are relatively low, but it'll be interesting to dig into that spot, because he is like a game breaking type guy who can technically do that in any spot. By the way, Miami is implied for only 16.5 points against Buffalo, which is shocking to me. Yeah. I had to check to see if weather was a factor. In fact, Stephon Diggs over on receiving yards is 69.5 yards, which he's beaten 10 of 13 games this year. Weather in Buffalo on Saturday night is like 30 degrees, snow flurries, light wind. So nothing that should scare people off that game. I thought that was pretty crazy. 16.5 implied points for the Miami Dolphins. But yeah, those are my thoughts on Fields. I don't know if you have any thoughts on Fields on your end.
No, I just think the matchup's horrible. Philadelphia not giving much up to running quarterbacks either. But I mean, just look at what he did when he was healthy, that he was head and shoulders above any other fantasy quarterback. So the upside's obvious. Last two guys I'll talk about is, do you have any thoughts on Alvin Kamara, which was like glaringly my worst call of the offseason? I just want to be kind to myself and say he's hurt and that's what's going on there. That plus Joe Burrow stacks. What would you do on the opposite side? Like, it's a bad matchup for all of Tom Brady's pass catchers. But I mean, the guy's throwing it 55 times per game. Theoretically, there should be PPR upside there. Or do we just have to like finally write them off? So yeah, Kamara and Tampa Bay, and then that's my final question.
Yeah, so Kamara, I've looked at him a lot this week. He's 6,800. He's against Atlanta. And then I go back to like my nephew who just started playing DFS like seriously this year and didn't really follow the NFL before, didn't really play fantasy before. And he asked me like a couple of months ago, before Kamara had his 42-pointer, he was like, why does everyone like Kamara? He's like, I was digging through like his game logs. He's like, he hasn't done anything in years. And I was like, yeah, it was like, we're kind of like, he had that 6 touchdown game in December of 2020. But like all of 2021, he didn't do anything. This year, he hadn't really done anything up to that point. It was like, yeah, this guy has upside. Like he used to just like smash all the time. But it was like, maybe we're just hanging on to the player he used to be, right? And then I think we all had him that 42-point week. We could kind of see it. This looks like a week where he could hit, but like he only has one other game over, I don't know, like 17 DraftKings points or something. So he's one of those guys who, at this point in the week, I'm just like, I really don't know, if that makes sense. I like him. Like when you first look at the slate, I like him. And then I'm just like, I got to dig into this more deeply because I don't know on this guy. On the Bucks, I think it's interesting, right? How are the Bengals good on defense? The Bengals are good on defense by just like making it difficult to march the field, but they only have 21 sacks on the year, right? The Cowboys have like over 50 sacks at this point. To put that in context, like 21 sacks is nothing. Not a ton of blitzing. Yeah, I kind of see it as like a spot where we look at the Bucks, we're like, the Bucks are awful. But then what is like the one thing Brady can still do with this offense is just like paper cut his way down the field. So I could see him being able to do that against the Bengals with Chris Godwin, even with Julio Jones, who saw 8 targets last week. And yeah, I don't think you need a bring back like Burrow to Chase. You're basically just saying Burrow's awesome. The Bengals are going to throw the ball a lot. The passes are going to go to Jamar Chase, right? Like that doesn't necessarily mean that Chris Godwin at like 6,700 or whatever is having a had to have it game. So I would be totally fine stacking Burrow and not having a bring back. Like I think that's mathematically sound. But with if you wanted to go that direction, I think Rachaad White against the Bengals team that tends to filter targets to the running back. I think that Julio Jones, I think Chris Godwin, I think any of them could have a good game in this spot. I think it's an interesting offense to play around with on a pretty thin slate.
I like it.
All right. With that, as always, thanks for hanging out with us. If you don't have fun, that's okay. Scott and I have fun hanging out together. But if you're still here in week 15 hanging out with us, that means you probably have fun as well. So thanks for hanging out with us as always. And we will see you on fantasy points throughout the week. We'll see you on 1 week season throughout the week. And we will see you at the top of the leaderboards on Sunday.